Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're just going to go ahead and get started. I know a few people are still joining, so we'll just take our time on our introduction here. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the 9th annual San Juan Islands Agricultural Summit. My name is Brook Brouwer, and I'm the WSU San Juan County Extension Director, and I will be one of your hosts for this afternoon's keynote. And before we begin, I would like to share a statement prepared collaboratively by our steering committee. A little over a year ago, many of us gathered in person at Camp Arkyla on Orcas Island for what was one of the last major in-person event gatherings in our agricultural community before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. We dearly miss the opportunity to connect together in one place and honor the challenges that many have experienced this past year. However, we are very excited by the opportunities that have come from restructuring and reimagining this event. This year, we are turning our focus to inspiration, education, and building of community around issues of racial and social justice at the intersection with the local food movement. With this intention in mind, we recognize and honor all peoples who have ancestral ties to these lands and waters. We recognize and honor our ancestors and all those living who have contributed their labor, experience, and knowledge to growing food and nourishing communities. We recognize the importance of amplifying the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in spaces where they've been silenced, marginalized, and excluded. With great gratitude, we welcome the speakers from those communities who will be sharing knowledge and experience with us as a part of this event. We recognize not only the land on which we live, but the systemic impacts of land control. For example, the establishment of Washington State University as a land-grant university was supported by profit from the sale of unceded Indigenous land. This was documented by High Country News, which found that nearly 11 million acres of expropriated Indigenous land were sold to help pay for the establishment of the 1862 land-grant universities across the United States. Within this educational context, systemic inequalities also persist. A 2013 study by the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities found that 61% of 1890 land-grant institutions, or historically Black colleges and universities, did not receive all their federally mandated state matching funds, resulting in a loss of $57 million for extension or research funding, while the 1862 universities within those same states received 100% of their matching funds. While acknowledging these historic and current injustices, we wish to move from acknowledgement to practice. It is our hope this event can offer a next step in building relationships, educating, and creating space for voices that have been silenced, marginalized, and excluded from the local food and agricultural conversation. Also take a moment to thank our sponsors for this event. Their support has helped us continue to offer the San Juan Islands Agricultural Summit year after year, and in particular this year provide honorariums for the time and experience of our many speakers and contributors. I would also like to thank our partner organizations and WSU staff and steering committee members that have helped design and host this event. Our steering committee this year included Sam Parr, Caitlin Leck, Sam Dillingham, Reese Torvald Hansen, Catherine Bryant Ingman, Steph Coffey, Faith Vandeput, as well as WSU staff, Wendy Waxman Kern, Walton Andrews. And I would like to particularly thank Kate McCulloch for providing the inspiration to pursue themes of racial and social justice and acting as a driving force to help make this event possible. As you well know, this is just the beginning of a series of events. Today, we're starting on a month-long endeavor. And please refer back to our website for event details and schedules. There's also troubleshooting tips there in terms of being able to access these events and work through the Zoom puzzles. Some of these different programs will allow for more or less interaction as we have arrange for some facilitated discussion in certain sessions. Others will be in this webinar format. Just as a reminder of a few housekeeping rules, for those more interactive sessions, we will ask you to keep yourself muted as much as possible. Please note these sessions will be recorded, so you may access them later. We're asking you to hold questions unless the speaker invites them. Because this is a Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A feature for questions, and we will do our best to work through and answer those. If you're in a Zoom meeting, which some of the study sessions and smaller events will be, if you want, you can rename yourself and indicate where you're from, and also feel free to turn on your video in those situations. Another just housekeeping note is you'll be receiving evaluation links either at the end of the webinar or in follow-up emails, and really appreciate the time you take to fill those out. Finally, I want to share a group of community commitments that our steering committee put together, recognizing that we've been entering some challenging conversations over the course of these events and taking on board new information that may be a stretch for some of us. In that mind, we will actively listen and honor the experiences that others have lived. We will create a space that allows for learning and growth. Move up, move up. If you are someone who speaks easily, move up into a listening role. If you listen easily, move up into a speaking role. We will be mindful of the intent versus impact of our statements and speak only from our own experiences. We have grace with each other. We all make mistakes. We acknowledge them and commit to change. So with that, now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Alison Conrad. Alison Conrad has a master's of public policy from the Duke Sanford School of Public Policy. Her research primarily focused on the impacts of whiteness, racism, and inequitable power dynamics on food policy and program. Conrad is dedicated to researching and advancing policy and programming that will create a more equitable food system through focusing on root cause work. And with that, I would love to turn it over to you, Alison, and let you begin your presentation.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about my research on white supremacy culture narratives in food systems. So we're gonna start just by giving a little bit of framing of what my research was and why we focus particularly on whiteness. Then I just wanted to go over a few definitions that are really important to what I'm talking about, just to make sure we have a shared understanding. Then I wanted to give some history like Brook did, just so we understand how the history in the United States impacts current inequities in the food system. Then I'm going to go into, in particular, talk about 4 of the 8 narratives that I identified and give some examples. And then I'm going to offer some what's next, some what you can do after you hear these narratives and start to understand how you can impact white biases in food work. But first, we're going to just start it off with a poll just to see where everyone's at.
I've launched a poll for you all, and you should be able to respond to that. So if you're able to, click on there, and we'll give you just a few minutes to respond. And then we will end that poll and share the results. Please keep in mind this is anonymous. We don't know your answer. Wonderful. Looks like we have about 75. I'll give you just one more moment here to answer the question, and then I'll turn it back over. Okay. Thank you so much for participating in the poll. I'll share the results.
Thanks, Brooke. So as you can see, it seems like a lot of people are aware of the impact of whiteness and white supremacy culture in the work in the food system. And then hopefully for those who are not, this presentation can help you through some definitions and through some examples, maybe see what we're talking about here and how it might be reflected in your own work. So with that, I will move on to the next part of the presentation. So research framing. In particular, I focused on a question looking at how we can see how white supremacy culture plays out in the food system. In particular, my research focused on food insecurity and food access in an urban context. So the narratives, while they come out from that specific part of the food system, we've found that they translate to a lot of different parts of the food system, and a lot of the underlying concepts can be seen throughout the food system. So I wanted to just give a little bit on why we decided to focus on whiteness and a little bit of what it is. So it's a social construction that both intentionally and unconsciously ends up justifying racism and discrimination. It's a lot about power and who has ownership in decision-making in systems. And in particular, it's a system of unequal distribution of power, ownership, and decision-making that is based on the color of your skin. And a lot of that means that whiteness is what is dominant. So it's the defaults we see in our culture. And as a result, people who are white tend not to see the impacts of white supremacy and their white privilege that they have because they're so used to it being the dominant power and not understanding how that influences their own lives as well as everyone else's. And so as a result, we found that it takes this process of stepping back and learning what you've been socialized to believe, maybe what history you were taught in school and how that might not be the whole story, and then going through a process where you're relearning history and understanding how racial equity plays into the food system and how we need to make sure that we're taking that into account if we want to create a better food system for all. And so I think this quote by Rachel Slocum, who's a researcher in this field, is emblematic of what we're talking about when we're saying that whiteness and white supremacy culture is a part of the food system and how it's a part of the whole food system, from talking about health and nutrition to farming and gardening to thinking about who gets funded for programming, as well as what type of spaces we inhabit and who is welcome in those spaces. And so now I'm just going to go into a few definitions, which I think might be helpful so that everyone sort of understands where we're coming from with this research and what it really means. So the first one is about white supremacy culture. And this is similar to whiteness, but in particular, it's talking about the system of privilege and power that white people have in society. And as a result of that, you can see it throughout policies and practices in the United States, going from the founding of America and thinking of how America was founded on a system of stolen land from indigenous peoples and stolen labor from enslaved Africans. And so a particular part of this that separates it from whiteness is talking about how white supremacy culture holds white people as inherently superior to others, and as a result are more deserving of getting funding for programming, directed resources, being offered opportunities, etc., being able to vote, those types of things. And one thing to note is that because whiteness and white supremacy culture are the norm and they're so embedded in our systems, everyone is subject to being socialized in white supremacy culture. And so as a result, you can see the characteristics and resulting attitudes and behaviors in anyone in any group. It doesn't just have to be a white-led or a predominantly white-led organization. It can affect everyone in every organization. Next, I wanted to specifically talk about structural racism and why we are talking specifically about structural racism versus other forms of racism. And so we focused here just because when we were looking at racism, we saw how much structural racism is based off of this system of white domination and white supremacy culture and results from policies and practices that are stemming from white supremacy. And part of the issue with structural racism is that it builds on itself. So structural racism is in all of our institutions. It is in our cultural norms. And so as a result, you have racist policies and practices back from when the country was founded to racist policies and practices that exist now. And they all compound on each other and create worse and worse outcomes as a result of those history merging with today, what's happening. And then lastly, we found that when we were looking at racism, that structural racism was the basis for all of the forms of racism, like individual, interpersonal, institutional, et cetera. And that made it one of the most pervasive forms. So we thought it was really important to talk about that in combination with what we were talking about with white supremacy culture. And then I also wanted to just set the stage of a term you'll hear me talking about, food apartheid, and why we've used that term as an alternative to something like food desert. So in particular, food desert is a term that's used a lot to describe an area that doesn't have access to a full service grocery store, but people have been talking about how it serves to not really talk about what's going on in communities, in particular because of the wording of desert, and how when you think of a desert, you think of something that is naturally occurring. And so it implies that these food deserts are somehow natural phenomenon rather than thinking of the deliberate policies and practices that created food access and food insecurities. For example, thinking of housing segregation and concentrated poverty and how that has impacted the ability to access food. And then second, it really kind of, if you think of a desert, you think of something dry and bare. So you're kind of implying that a community is lacking something when they may have food there, but not in a full service grocery store. And there still are people living there with life and resilience and, you know, business opportunities. And there are lots of things in those communities that get overlooked when just considering it something that's lacking. In contrast, food apartheid is a term that takes the food system and puts it into, you know, our broader systems, our broader culture, and looks specifically about what social and racial inequities exist in the food system and in our larger culture, and ties them together so that we're looking at what policies, practices, systems created inequities, so that when we go to address those inequities, we are addressing them with also policies, practices, and systems. And so after going into these definitions, I just wanted to get a little bit of an understanding of maybe how familiar you are with the term food apartheid, and if you've used it. Brooke, if you want to launch the poll.
Still a few more answers trickling in there. If anybody else want to vote on the poll, I'll give a few more seconds here. Okay, thank you so much. I'll end the poll.
Thank you. So you can see that a little over the majority has never heard of it. So I urge you to look into this term. I hadn't heard of it when I first started this work, and then I found that it really shifted how I was thinking about issues in the food system to actually think about the social and racial inequities as exist, and how a lot of the issues in the food system are a result of policies and practices. And I hope maybe going forward that you'll start using this term in comparison to food desert. And I think this quote I wanted to give by Karen Washington, who is a food activist, a food justice activist, kind of sets us up for talking about the rest of the presentation when we're talking about power, and we're also talking about what is happening and what could happen. In particular, this quote talks about, you know, people with capital from outside of a community coming in and starting a business or starting a program instead of investing capital and funding directly into the community to help build wealth within that community. And I think those are two different perspectives that I hope you get out of this presentation, that we're trying to move towards community solutions that invest in communities and help build wealth. So now I'm just going to go into a history of inequities in the food system, giving some examples of particular policies. And so one thing I wanted to say is the reason why we found that it's helpful to look at what the history was so that we understand the racist policies and practices that have created food systems issues, so that when we're thinking through policy to unwind these inequities, we're taking into account what has happened in history and making sure we also don't repeat it. So I'm going to go through 5 specific categories here, and then after this go into some specific policies that are and give a little bit more detail there. So first, just wanted to touch on thinking through land appropriation and how European settlers came to the United States and forced indigenous populations off their lands and away from the sustainable agricultural and food ways that they had been cultivating for thousands of years. Despite what traditional narratives say about indigenous peoples, they had been carefully tending to the land for thousands of years, and just by forcing them off their land, we disconnected them from their traditional food ways, as well as sort of robbed the broader culture from getting to understand those food ways. Next, something I mentioned a little bit is thinking about housing segregation, and in particular, thinking of policies like the GI Bill, which ended up being discriminatory against Black Americans, and redlining sort of didn't allow Black Americans to get loans to buy houses or to upkeep of houses, creating areas where you had segregated housing, and then you also had systems of concentrated poverty and blight, creating these food apartheid issues and the issues with access to food and investment in communities. Similar with that is thinking through how urban planning was done and how through systems of not equally investing in different communities, you created areas where certain often Black, Indigenous, or communities of color that don't have certain amenities like access to parks or safe sidewalks to walk on, but also issues with environmental racism, where you have an overabundance of landfills or other hazardous plants in predominantly BIPOC areas and not in white areas. And sort of leading off the past 3 things, you can think of how those might have impacted the racial wealth gap and the ability to, gain wealth from owning a business or owning land, and then combining with that with what we see with employment discrimination and wage gaps, and how that really has created a system where white wealth is astronomical and BIPOC wealth is not. And there's huge disparities in ability to pass down wealth. And you can think of that through if you wanted to start a food or agriculture business, how hard would it be to raise capital to do that? And then lastly, I wanted to touch a little bit just thinking through migrant labor and how our immigration laws impact the ability for migrant farmers to own land or own a business so that they can gain wealth and gain equity through an agricultural business or starting their own farm. And also a lot of laws don't protect them from discrimination or from harm also. And so I'm going to touch on a couple of policies, and these 2 in particular are focused on land ownership. So the Homestead Act in 1862 took land from indigenous nations and gave it in the West and gave it to any American who applied. It was basically all white Americans. Other Black Americans were virtually not allowed to apply and get land. And if you think of, there was about 250 million acres of land that became privately owned. And you can think of, since 1862, how much wealth may have been accumulated from being able to purchase and own that land. Second are heirs property laws. And these are really interesting. It's something I learned about recently. But heirs property laws are a system where when the owner of land dies and they didn't have a will, all of their descendants inherit an interest in the land like you would inherit stock in a company. And as a result, that means different descendants can sell off pieces of land, and you end up with a lot of Black land loss in particular. And it's said to be one of the leading causes of involuntary Black land loss. And so looking at this, if it says here 90% of Black Americans lost their farmland because of this since 1910, again, you can think of how much wealth was lost from losing land, essentially. Next, Brooke talked about this a little bit, but talking about the Morrill Act, which is what established the 1862 schools. And as he said, Washington State is a 1862 school. But one thing to note is in the creation of these schools, they were, majority were segregated. So non-white students were not able to enroll. So this was the impetus for about 30 years later, the second Morrill Act, which in particular stipulated that Black Americans should be included in the system, but it didn't require that schools integrate their colleges. It just required that they create a separate college and gave them funding to do that. But as Brooke said, there's a lot of research on discrepancies between the funding that was received by those schools historically as well as today. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch a little bit about the USDA. In 1964, a report found that there was discrimination in all parts of the USDA. And as a result, you had segregation. So Black farmers weren't able to access the same services, as well as they weren't involved in a lot of the decision-making processes and programs from the USDA. Following up to that, in 1999, you had the Pigford case where the court ruled that the USDA had discriminated against Black farmers when they were applying for loans, denying them loans or giving them unfair terms. As a result, you had a $1 billion settlement given to thousands of farmers. However, there's been a lot of criticism over the ability for farmers to actually claim that they were discriminated against, either not having enough proof or not having documents that say that they owned the land. A lot of issues going back to documentation as a result of slavery and ownership there. And so following that up, just thinking about in the food system, how do these policies end up creating racial inequities in the food system? First, you can think of how it's impacted, the physical landscapes that people live in, thinking of what is the impact of housing segregation, what is the impact of stripping land away from Indigenous people and forcing them to live on reservations, and how we've separated people from being able to access traditional diets and culturally appropriate foods that are good for them and allow them to feel connected to their traditions. Next, you can think about it through food insecurity rates. Black, Latinx, and Indigenous household rates are much, much higher than white household food insecurity rates, about 2 to 3 times higher. And then finally, I've touched on, wealth a bit, but if you think about it in particular, thinking through what has happened with COVID-19 and, people losing their jobs and not being able to, having a lot of medical debt potentially from getting sick, family wealth and just wealth in general is super important to being able to weather that hardship. And also, as we said, it can impact who is able to have capital to start a food or agriculture business. So after all this, give another poll.
So whiteness and racism, right?
Yeah.
Folks are being quiet here. There you go. We'll give people a little bit more time to think on this one. We've had about 50% voted. Okay. Looks like majority of folks have answered there, so I'm going to go ahead and close this last call for any votes. All right.
Thanks. So it looks like most people answered disparities in land ownership, followed by, trying to read this correctly, looks like access to capital and inequitable access to food. This seems, we hear a lot of these different issues. I am still now just learning more about disparities in land ownership and how that impacts different things and getting into the history there. So it's interesting to see that that was the highest here.
Alison, we just got a couple comments that folks felt like they could have answered with many of the choices.
Yes, thinking back through it now, probably should have made it multiple choice. So we could have seen all of the things, but the land ownership is such a new subject to me that it's interesting to see how important it is here.
Thank you.
Moving on to the next section. So here I'm going to go through 4 of the 8 narratives that I identified. So this fun graphic maps them out a bit. The 8 items on the right are the 8 narratives that I identified. I will note again, these were specific to thinking about food insecurity and food access policy and programming, but I've seen that the concepts behind these narratives and what we were talking about connect to a lot of broader issues within the food system. And to the left, you can see there are 3 things: individualism, paternalism, and neoliberalism. And we found that across the 8 narratives that these 3 broader kind of white supremacy culture narratives impacted all of them, and often you had multiple things working together. So here, when we talk about individualism, we're talking about focusing on individual actions and behaviors rather than looking at structural forces. When we talk about paternalism, we're talking about coming into a community and prescribing solutions to them rather than taking the time to listen and ask what the community may need. And third is neoliberalism. And in this case, we're in particular talking about an emphasis on personal responsibility and working hard as solutions to poverty and hunger. So first, I wanted to give a little bit of just background on what these narratives will have in common and sort of what I see as the big pictures to take away from these narratives. And the first is that they emphasize, as I said, individual actions, and in particular, they just end up really hyper-focusing on one thing that people can do instead of thinking through how can we try to fix systems by looking at structural issues, which is a lot harder, but will create longer term solutions and end up creating a more equitable food system. And then second, as I mentioned before, when we're talking about power, these narratives really illuminated for me that there's such an unequal distribution of power and decision-making in food policy and in programming. And so for me, it was really helpful to sort of be able to see these different power dynamics at play and really sort of start to unpack for myself who is making decisions around food policy and programming and how can we change that. So the first narrative I'm going to get into is something called If They Only Knew. And so I first came across this term reading research by Julie Guthman, and then I found in my own research that it was supported by people that I talked to and interviewed. So in particular here, when we're talking about if they only knew, we're talking about taking issues of like unhealthy eating and nutrition and boiling them down to being about someone's individual behavior or actions, often treating that if they're not eating healthy, that they don't understand or don't have the knowledge of what is healthy and what is good for them, rather than talking about maybe what structural forces are at play to impact someone's ability to eat healthy. So, thinking of what access to food do they have? Can they afford food? Can they access transportation to get to and from the store? Do they have time to be cooking their own meals all the time? Those types of things are sort of the broader picture to start looking at rather than thinking of people's choices being based on purely a lack of knowledge. And I think this quote from someone that I interviewed was really helpful for me to think about how then, as a result, we focus on nutrition education and we put the emphasis on the people who live in neighborhoods who they may not have access or may not be able to afford food, and rather than the systems, like I talked about, that have impacted them and created the issues that they're facing. And then it also has this aspect of paternalism, where often you have, an outside organization or decision maker getting to come into the community and sort of presume they know more than the individual about what is healthy or what is nutritious, and therefore get to tell them and have to educate them. So one example of this is thinking of SNAP Ed programs. And this is not at all to say that nutrition education is bad or is not useful. In particular, we're just trying to point out that it ends up being sort of a replacement for thinking of bigger picture. It ends up emphasizing the wrong thing and not thinking about, the root causes of nutrition issues that impact healthy behaviors. And then a second thing that we talk about here a little bit is thinking through sort of who gets to determine what is healthy or what is good or bad, and sort of thinking of back to whiteness and how it is the dominant culture. How is it also the dominant culture when we talk about food and what is healthy? Thinking of the fact that we sort of default to a whitened diet, you can think of an example of kale being seen as super healthy. In contrast, collard greens has about basically the same nutritional value, but it's not often seen in the same way that kale is, because it's often associated with poor Southerners and Black Southerners, and a lot of racial undertones there that see it as not healthy. Next is one called vote with your fork. This is a term that I came across in a lot of early 2000s information, existing all the way till now in some more modern things. But in particular, it sort of really focuses on what individuals are consuming as a way to signal what they value in the food system. So saying that they want more sustainably grown food or want more socially just food, and that because individuals are buying those things, that they will then result in companies deciding that they're going to shift to more sustainable or socially just food systems practices. And part of the issue here is thinking through, who has power in the food system, and the people with the most power are the food and agriculture companies, are the government who gets to set regulation. And as a result of focusing on the individual, we shift that responsibility from the companies and the governments that are responsible for a lot of the issues in our food system to the individual who has the least amount of power. And one way to think of that is to think of like an agricultural sustainability campaign, for example, something around eating sustainable beef. Part of the problem here is that it ends up kind of getting into that individualism part where you have to show your environmental sustainability through your individual purchases rather than through creating change by forcing the government to implement different regulations or really forcing companies to take responsibility for the issues that they've created. Part of that individualism is also leaving out those who can't afford, don't have the purchasing power to show that they value agricultural sustainability, because these campaigns are relying on just these individual acts. And as a result, you can see a lot of gatekeeping around those not participating being seen as less than or other, and that they just don't believe in this eating locally or ethically, when in reality they just don't have the ability to buy things to participate in that way. And another, this one, communities can't take care of themselves, was one that was super helpful to me and has really actually impacted how I've been approaching my food systems work. As the name kind of implies here, this narrative is based in a belief that communities are unable to sort of provide for themselves and make decisions. And because they can't do that, they're lazy or undeserving, and they need to be helped. They need to be prescribed solutions. And this is really problematic because a lot of these beliefs over being lazy or undeserving are based in negative racial and class stereotypes And what you end up doing is reinforcing, the power at play here of one getting to code some people as lazy or undeserving, but also it often means that white-led organizations from outside of a community are given that decision-making power and that funding to launch food policy and programming in a low-income or a BIPOC community. And then another part of this is just that aspect of assuming that you know better than the community because you have determined that they need to be helped, rather than thinking through that a community will know better about what its needs are than an outside organization will be. And one way that we've tried to capture how to think about this is just thinking of a mobile produce market, which is an initiative to try to bring fresh fruits and vegetables into a community in sort of mobile van way. And in this case, we're talking about thinking through a white-led organization from outside of a community, deciding to bring a mobile produce market into a majority Black or Indigenous community without consulting them. And we're focused on this because we found that it creates this imbalance of power through creating an infrastructure where you're giving funding to white-led institutions, funding their salaries and their initiatives to address issues in the community where they're not based or they don't understand the lived experience of, instead of thinking that you can invest directly in the community to solve community issues. And so you also see patterns where you are ignoring community-led solutions because they're often looked over in the funding process or are just crowded out by these outside institutions coming into the community. And then last, I wanted to touch a little bit on food charity. And what we mean here is not to say at all that food charity is bad. It's definitely something with the levels of hunger in America that so many people need food now, but we're really trying to focus in on how was food charity created and how we can create better solutions to create long-term, address hunger long-term. And so here, a lot of this focus on food charity is rooted in this idea of personal responsibility and work ethic, and that if you just apply yourself more, you can get out of hunger and poverty, and that the government is not responsible at all for helping people get out of poverty, but also for creating the issues that we have. And so as a result, the solution to that is to focus on food distribution and giving someone a temporary solution to their hunger issues and their poverty issues, instead of thinking through, how can I help them economically through giving, economic assistance, thinking through structural things like increasing the minimum wage, helping provide capital to start a business so you can build wealth in your community, all those types of things. Think through the issues of hunger and the root causes of hunger more structurally in a way that would help us address it more long-term. And then secondary to that is this focus on food charity becomes an issue because it really does focus on, individuals sort of coming in to save people, and that by them doing good, that they're going to sort of solve hunger, and that it's a problem that can be solved that way, rather than, as I said, a way that thinking of the structural factors in the United States that created systems where we have, 40 million people that are hungry. And one way to think about this sort of abdication of responsibility is thinking of what has happened with SNAP. And SNAP was passed, and after that it has, throughout the last 60 years faced so much attack by politicians who don't believe that people need to be on it, and so they're restricting access, they're cutting benefits, adding work requirements, etc., which makes it really hard for households to enroll or stay enrolled in SNAP. And so what you see here is that it's again something that shifts responsibility, especially a moral responsibility of caring for people who are the most vulnerable in the United States, from the government using SNAP or economic assistance, to private nonprofits where you have, over 60,000 emergency food providers in the United States. We have another poll.
for white supremacy culture?
Yeah, I believe so.
Give a few more seconds for folks to respond. Great. Looks like we're about there.
Thank you. So it's great to see that so many people are seeing that white supremacy culture does show up in your work. And I think that that's a great first place to start, understanding that these white supremacy does impact the food system, and then set this up nicely for going into what I will talk about next, which is sort of what you can do next. So to start, I want to note sort of 4 things, and then I'll go into more detail on a lot of these. But I think one thing that's been important that has helped me understand how to do this is thinking through needing to do work to unpack biases and to understand white supremacy and racism at an individual level, as well as working to do it within your organization together, as well as then thinking through larger levels like institutional or structural. But in particular, I found that it's been super helpful in my workplace to know that I'm doing the work on an individual level, but also work with my colleagues together for us all to help understand how at an organizational level that we perpetuate these biases and can help unpack them. Second, as I mentioned before, it is a process of unlearning and then learning and relearning. And I think that this is really important to sort of set the frame for how you can move forward. Then a lot of it for us has been about building relationships and trust with the community members and community organizations so that we can help to create better policies and programs. And then lastly, it's about understanding your mistakes and then holding yourself accountable to making change. And so one of the first things for the learning unlearning that I have found is super important is thinking about how racism and white supremacy are embedded in the food system. And so I've alluded to this a little bit earlier, but a couple of questions you can think about on your own and start to unpack these things is thinking about land and labor, and how was the American agricultural system and whose land and labor was used. Also, for me, thinking about food access and food insecurity issues and what policies in your local community, as well as federally, have created issues of food access and food insecurity. And then lastly, to sort of think intersectionally, looking at how racial, class, and gender inequities exist in the food system, and then sort of unpacking maybe what policies and practices have created those inequities. A next one that has been helpful to me is to think through how society and the food system are not race neutral, because sort of building off the previous slide, because racism and white supremacy are built into the system, that spaces cannot be race neutral, and therefore policies and programming need to take into account race and racial equity in order to address inequities. Otherwise, you'll sort of fail to make up for that history of policies and practices. And a couple ways to start thinking about that is just in your everyday life when you're engaging in food spaces, like going to a restaurant or going to a farmer's market, just to start thinking through some of the racial and class compositions that you see there, and then asking yourself why you might be in a space that you're only seeing one particular type of person. And follow up with that is then thinking through what does that mean and how maybe, spaces being inhabited by a lot of white bodies might make it uncomfortable for non-white people to want to enter that space and participate in that food space. Third is sort of getting into whiteness and privilege and understanding how that might have influenced how you experience the food system, as well as why you want to work in the food system and how it might show up in your current work today. And so a couple ways to think about this is thinking on some of that ownership piece of who owns, a grocery store in your community, who is gaining wealth from it, but then in contrast, thinking of who is working there and why might you have that power imbalance between who owns the store and who works there. And then second, it gets back to sort of these issues of capital that we're talking about, of how difficult would it be for you to access, a bank to get a loan, to ask for capital from your own networks, from your own family, to start an agricultural business, and what might be related to that. And then lastly, it's sort of getting to these final issues of power and decision-making in the food system, and how that, impacts what we're talking about in terms of, the policies and programs we want to put forth, what are seen as the best policies and programming. Even, when you're thinking of best practices, who's getting to determine what the best practice is. And a part of that is starting to look at, at your own business, in your own organization, in your local government, who sits in positions of power and gets to make final decisions, and then going beyond maybe your own immediate scope, but other businesses and organizations in the community, and thinking about who sits in those positions of power and how that all might work together to create issues and imbalances of power and decision-making. And then second is thinking about what goals are in these policies and programming and capital decisions what are the goals and who's making the decision over the goals, as well as I think it's important to think of who benefits from decisions of starting a program and who is a program aimed at, and how might those different power dynamics be at play between who gets to decide what the goals are and who is supposed to benefit from those goals and those policies. And now that gets us into relationship building, which has been something that's been really important in my work and the work that I'm doing with the center that I work at. And that's thinking about how we've shifted our work to make sure that we are working in relationship with community and working with them instead of working on behalf of them, asking what we can do for them rather than what they can do for us. And as a part of that, we've been very explicitly sort of changing our processes so that we're approaching the work from a racially equitable relational approach, thinking through that, the processes we go through need to engage multiple stakeholders, have advisory boards, and listen to the advisory boards and give them power, and make sure that we are thinking through whatever we're going to do and what impact it might have on racial inequities in the food system. And this is in particular for us coming from a research perspective, where often a lot of academic research can be extractive, where you go into a community and you sort of take knowledge and you don't compensate for it. So we're really trying to shift that on its head by asking how we can, work with communities and have our work benefit them as well, and not just us. And then lastly, this is something that one of our community partners has said, of relationships build at the speed of trust. And this has been super helpful for me, of thinking through that there is a lot of mistrust between white-led institutions and BIPOC communities and individuals. So when you're trying to start to shift towards this relationship building, it's not going to happen immediately. And there's a lot of that mistrust that you have to sort of work and prove that you are not going to treat them and harm them like past white-led institutions might have. So you sort of need to change your expectations and make sure that you are listening to people and building that trust, rather than getting frustrated when maybe you're not getting the immediate results that you want. And then lastly, it's about accountability, and in particular, really understanding that we are making mistakes. We're not approaching this from a place where you have to be perfect. I think I often do that, where I think that I need to know everything and be completely on point to understand what the work, but in reality, we're all going to make mistakes. And so don't get defensive when you make that mistake, and instead sort of take a step back and decide to learn from your misstep and what you did, and listen to people when they say that you've done something wrong, and then commit to doing better. And part of doing that is you can help by sharing the lessons that you've learned with others, with people around you, to help educate them, as well as serve as a way to be like, I made this mistake, this is what I learned, to help hold me accountable to change course and change what I'm doing. So we have our last poll.
Great. I will launch that. Alison, why am I launching that poll? We had a question of what's a BIPOC community? Could you just explain that acronym, please?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, should have done that earlier. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And so it's a term that's specifically used to pull out that Black and Indigenous populations face a lot of heavy racial discrimination. And so in particular, it helps to highlight that people of color are also not one monolith, and that there are, varying levels of discrimination that happen, and pull out, two groups of people, Black and Indigenous, that have been ignored often in conversations.
Just give folks a few more seconds here, almost to 75%. Anybody wants to put in a vote? Okay. Looks like we're slowing down here, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Thank you, Brooke. So it looks like people pretty even, but a little bit more want to learn how to do the individual work. And so hopefully we can maybe touch on that a bit in the Q&A. But I think that a lot of these things that I've just touched on in the last few slides about thinking about how you can educate yourself, Google is the best resource, but there's a lot of great books out there, as well as I think, coming to this presentation is a great first step to start to understand how whiteness and that bias might impact your work. And at the end of, I'll go to the next slide. So I have a research brief written on this that is available on our website, and I can make sure that the link gets sent out, that goes into more detail of the narratives, as well as it has some resources at the end. And we also are working on creating a standalone document with some more resources that have been really beneficial to our work on this project, as well as our work in our learning journey with the center that I work for. And with that, I think we could open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alison. Really, really appreciate that presentation. I find it very, very thought-provoking for my own work and how to think about these issues moving forward. So I would really encourage folks to enter questions into the Q&A feature. You can type in questions, and we'll go through and answer those live. At this point, we probably won't be able to open it up to spoken questions, but really would love to see your written questions. So while people just take a moment to think about that, please go ahead. I will ask a few that have kind of been kicking around in my own mind and in minds of some of the other organizers here. So I think one of the questions that I often see is recognizing that, our community, according to the census, is, 95% white. And the question that we struggle with is, how do we involve Black, Indigenous, and people of color in food system work without tokenizing those contributions? And just what kind of tools you would recommend for creating a welcoming space and engaging folks in a meaningful way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say for us, it definitely has started with that aspect of relationship building and trying to show to them that they can trust us and we're not here to just, exploit them or tokenize them, and that we're really here for an opportunity to listen to their lived experience and how that has impacted the food system for them. And then how can our work and our research help to create and support maybe the work that they're already doing if it's a community organization, or help fix some of those issues in the food system and address some of those racist policies and practices. And so I think part of it comes down to that relationship building. It comes down to listening, but something that I heard in some of the research I was doing is also not just listening, but it's about power and sort of going who has decision making. So if you're going to, say, launch an advisory board to get more people with different lived experiences, it's not about just having the advisory board, but giving them the power to be involved in what decisions are happening, to have their voices heard and actually impact the work, rather than feeling like they are brought to the table, but not able to actually have a vote at it. And I should have said, one of my colleagues from the Duke World Food Policy Center is here with me as well to help answer questions. So I'd love to also get her perspective on this as well. Jen.
Thanks so much, Allie, and thanks so much for having us here for this presentation. My name is Jen Zuckerman, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the World Food Policy Center. And I think the question that you ask is a really critical question. And I love that in the last poll, while there were a number of responses, one of the main responses was that folks were interested in doing the individual work. Because what happens so often in this work that we do, and a lot of the work that I do involves not just working at the World Food Policy Center, but also working with a number of racial equity consultants holding white caucuses. And in those white caucuses, that question always comes up. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And the first thing I always offer is, instead of asking what to do, let's focus on how to be. And that's a question that takes a long time to unwind, because as we started the presentation focusing specifically on whiteness, we're conditioned and socialized to be a very specific way. And so there's so much that we do that has these unintended impacts on individuals that we're trying to form relationships with, that we don't even know that we're doing. And what I tell folks in the caucuses that I do is, the only thing that we're guaranteed to do is mess it up. And by learning and unlearning, staying humble, and a lot of it is getting that understanding of how you might be feeling in different spaces. A lot of times, if you're uncomfortable, then you're actually doing the work that you need to do. The more comfortable that you are, the more whitened a space you've created. So those are some recommendations that I would give. And as Allie said, also, that decision-making and power shift is so critical to how this can show up differently in these spaces, and to really avoid that, the act of tokenizing.
Great, thank you so much. A number of questions coming in here. So one of the first ones that was asked is, can you talk a little bit about your research approach and methodology? Did you go through a series of interviews and coming up with the narratives that you described?
Yeah, so this actually started as my master's thesis. And so when I structured that project, it was based in doing a heavy literature and document review, and sort of taking a grounded theory approach where I identified some of the narratives and where they exist in the literature. And then I talked to members of community and leaders of community organizations, in particular talking to a lot of people who worked for POC or Black-led organizations and getting their perspectives of what they saw in their day-to-day work of how did these biases come up to affect how they're funded, and also then asked a series of questions of what they thought white-led institutions could do better, which has led us into sort of a secondary part of our research of really trying to shift sort of like what the quote from Karen Washington said of from this approach of coming into communities, but to one where we're investing directly in communities, and how do we create what we sort of called counter narratives that serve to show examples of how BIPOC-led and BIPOC-founded organizations are sort of working in counter to these broader systems that historically have tried to keep them down.
Great, thank you. Folks have figured out that they can upvote other folks' questions here. So if you have one that out there you really see that you really like, so I'll go with the one at the top here. And its question is, how might employees address the issue of performative policies and statements when leadership is moderate and resistant to real progress?
That's a great question. I might defer to Jen on that one. I am not sure I have a great answer, and I think she might be able to provide a different perspective for that.
Great, thanks so much, Allie. Sorry, I had to unmute myself note up there. So this is a really tricky situation that I think a lot of white people working in predominantly white institutions are dealing with. And so there is my background is in philanthropy, and the reality of philanthropy is that philanthropic dollars, for the most part, are built on this uneven distribution of wealth. And what's happening within philanthropy is that there is this history of capital gains as a result of inequitable distribution of power. And then folks working in philanthropy now are seeking to redistribute those dollars back into community. But we've got this history, we've got this legacy, and there's so many board of trustees that are tied to the history and the legacy of these organizations. And so that's just one example. Also working within Duke University. So Duke University is a historically white institution that has a lot of policies and procedures that are designed specifically to protect the power of Duke University. And it is working within first small groups to come up with, what are the issues that we're facing within our own organization. So just working as the World Food Policy Center we're in the broader Sanford School of Public Policy, and then within the broader area of Duke. And we've actually had to, first identify what are the issues that we're facing that are policy, what are the issues that we're facing that are practice. And when the issues are policy, how do we address those from a fact? Is it a legal precedent or is it actually policy? So basically something that we've just all agreed to, and who's benefiting from the ways of doing things that we've just all agreed to. And getting people on board is a huge part of our role as white individuals working to be anti-racist in predominantly white institutions. So what we're seeking to do is, one, again, it's repetitive, but it's going back to that understanding of how whiteness and white supremacy culture shows up for yourself. Two, working with other white colleagues to identify what needs to be changed. And then also, it is a slow and it is a very deeply strategic process of beginning this education and showing how things can be different as a result of working towards, and this is what we share, working towards liberation, to demonstrate that we are all made better by these policies that hold all of us down, actually, and that it is very few that actually benefit from those policies and practices. So I would say, just short, that it's slow. It has to be very intentional. It has to be very relational. You have to think about the message and the messenger. So, I try and have conversations if I'm trying to get white men in power to change how they might be thinking. I talk to other white men in power who are on their journey, who can have that conversation with other white men in power at a similar level. So it has to be very strategic about who and how has those conversations. And this is it's a long and complicated answer, and I'll stop there, but glad to answer more offline.
I just wanted to do one follow-up question on that. We talked a little bit in the presentation, and Alison mentioned land-grant universities. Just curious about Duke, if there's any conversation around the behaviors of James P. Duke and in relation to his role with impoverished tobacco farmers of his day.
Within the broader Duke, there are executive level conversations, and then also very much the conversations tend to start more at the, let's say, grassroots within the different colleges, and definitely within the students. So there are a lot of conversations going on that's really reckoning with the history of Duke. And I did see that one question also in the chat box as it relates to land grant universities. And Michigan State, their Center for Regional Food Systems, has been doing a lot of training as it relates to cooperative extension and land grant institutions. And so we can also send links to those resources as well.
Great, thank you. Another question that's floated to the top here. In addition to unlearning and relearning and addressing my personal bias, what is a tangible step that I can take to dismantle white supremacy in my specific community and local food system?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it gets sort of into the individual as well as maybe not organizational, but communal aspect of doing this, not just yourself, but with others. And I think a great way to have it is to have conversations with people. So if you're, talking with someone and they say something that you're learning is problematic, of stopping them, and, it is uncomfortable, but that's the point of being like, oh, actually that stems from white supremacy, and here are some great resources of what you can learn more, and here is why that's an issue. And it's almost that interpersonal level sort of starting with, but also I think, advocacy, I get some people with the nonprofit, there's barriers with being able to do advocacy, but I think getting engaged in local advocacy that is happening in your community that might be focused on this, and how are local grassroots organizations, in particular BIPOC-led organizations, talking about these issues, and then figuring out through their work and that advocacy how you can support that and take part in that. I think advocacy is a really great way, as well as, I think, as a white person, it comes down to, like, a lot of times we expect Black people or BIPOC people to educate us rather than educate each other, or white people educating each other. So I've tried hard in my personal life to introduce, family member and friends to the research that I'm doing, and, try to talk to them in certain ways when they maybe say something that is problematic, and just start with that interpersonal level as well. I don't know if you have anything to add, Jen.
Maybe a question to build on that a little bit, and maybe Jen, you can touch to this. So you spoke about the importance of change at the political and legislative level, and rather than placing all that emphasis on the individual responsibility, how would you like to see that type of work taking place? And are there recent examples you've seen of positive policy change?
Yeah, I think that it's also important to think of local, state versus federal, because there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved in. And I found in a lot of food systems work, the federal government is doing some cool things, but I've found that local governments are doing a lot of really innovative work on the food system. And that might be a really great place to start, is how can you impact your local government and push, city council members to think through different ordinances of, for example, this may not be a recent thing, but thinking through things like cottage food laws and how in certain areas, you can't bake foods in your home and sell it from that, and how that might be a barrier for people who can't get capital to start a brick and mortar business, but they would be able to do it from their home. And thinking through, like, can you advocate for what is like this cottage food law to make it so that people are able to, start a business from their home rather than having to get all of the capital involved in starting a business with a specific location. Jen, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's two state level policies that have been, one has been enacted into legislation and one is in the process of being enacted into legislation. So the state of Virginia had a healthy food access fund that was enacted into legislation. I believe it was about this time last year. However, there was also a qualifier with that healthy food access fund that was legislated, that healthy food access fund had to be governed by an equitable food oriented development steering committee. And so this was legislated power of decision making of where those funds go into an equitable food oriented development is something that you can also look up. The website is efod.org, efod.org. And so what that legislation did was put the decision making of where dollars go into Black and Brown led market-based businesses that were community rooted. So they were in communities and they were accountable to communities. And then there's also a fund that's being developed off of healthy food financing dollars in New Mexico right now that is may not be structured the same, but also looking towards equitable food oriented development legislation in New Mexico. And then hyper locally in Durham, one of the things that happened as a result of COVID is one of our community partners, an organization called Communities in Partnership, which is a Black woman-led, Black woman-founded, community accountable organization. When they saw that the majority of Black and Brown food businesses in the Durham area weren't able to access payroll protection dollars or SBA loans as a result of COVID, they started what was called the Thriving Community Fund, which was essentially a reparations fund. So they sought out white dollars to go into this fund that will then go directly into Black and Brown businesses in the Durham area. So to answer the question as it relates to what's something immediate that could happen, there is, reparative dollars that can go into an immediate action of Black and Brown founded and Black and Brown accountable organizations, giving dollars to those organizations. And then every day as a white person, we live in a level of privilege. So that individual work is so important to understand how we as individuals and how we as institutions leverage that power and positionality that we have, again, back in terms of support of, as opposed to on behalf of, community-led organizations. So always being mindful of what power and positionality and privilege we hold, and see how that can be something that can be an offer in a conversation.
Great, thank you. I think maybe kind of, building on that theme, one of the questions is, can you provide some examples of research and work being done and conducted by Black, Indigenous, people of color communities that have influenced this discussion, your work, your presentation?
Yeah, as Jen said, we work a lot with Communities in Partnership, and they do a lot of amazing work in Durham. Some great organizations are the Detroit Black Food Security Network, I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but out of Baltimore, the Black Church Food Security Network, Mandela Partners in California. Those three are equitable food oriented type organizations who are focused on community wealth building and creating networks of, in particular, the Detroit and the Baltimore locations of connecting Black farmers with networks to sell their products at a fair rate. And I think in terms of researchers, Tima Okun was a great resource for me in understanding white supremacy culture. They have it's available, and if you just search Tima Okun and white supremacy culture online, it'll come up a nice PDF that lays out a lot of different examples of white supremacy culture they've seen in organizations. Jen, do you have more? I think I'm blanking.
Yeah, I think you named so many of the groups that are doing this work. So there's an entire equitable food-oriented development network. There is also the HEAL Alliance. There are, I'm trying to think what MANNERS stands for, but it is, MANNERS is all around young Black farmers as well. There's also organizations like the First Nations Development Institute, focusing specifically on supporting Indigenous efforts in food systems. And I'll drop in the chat box a couple of these organizations we recommended and listed that are doing this work.
I also note someone in the Q&A mentioned Civil Eats, and that's actually, they have some really amazing journalism on this and have done some great profiles highlighting Black and brown organizations that are doing food justice and food sovereignty work.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I also encourage folks to check out the speakers and organizations in the upcoming study groups in particular that I think will be some important leaders in those discussions. Another question, and this I think has been touched on a little bit, but the training, of these concepts for university extension services, the attendee noted that in my experience, that is much needed. So as a university extension person, I definitely appreciate that. And I will just comment that within Washington State University, there's been effort across extension to have study groups and conversations around topics of race and diversity. And there's plenty more work to do, but I guess curious if either of you have any other examples of that work being done.
Yeah, I just have started speaking on these things, so I wouldn't say I do any formal trainings. Something we've done in our research center is we're relatively small, we're around 10 people, but we've started reading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, so that and then we'll have a monthly meeting to discuss what we've read, so that it's just getting back to that history piece that I touched on earlier, that we're all starting to have a similar understanding of how was, the United States founded, how was the ideology of white supremacy before that created and led to, European colonizers coming over into North America. And I think to me, that's been super helpful of making sure that, us as a primarily white institution and organization in particular are all sort of starting to understand this, even if we all are a little bit at different pages of how invested in how much we understand this work, that it's sort of been helpful to convince some people to, by looking at that history, how embedded it really is and how then we can explicitly incorporate that into our work.
Great, thank you. And we have a few more minutes here. We're a lot of good questions. So one just practical question is it possible to make your slides available? So this recording will be made available to participants, and you have a excellent document report that you've prepared, and we can share a link out to that. But so yes, Maria and Sandy, we may or may not be able to share we'll follow up on that.
Yeah, I would definitely say our research brief is available, and we are currently working on, especially because we've expanded that research even more as we've been working on these slides to incorporate a lot more resources. So we're working on putting together a resource document with a lot of the things that were sourced in this material to have that on our website as well. So be looking for that.
Okay, just put a link to that resource brief into the chat there for folks. So thank you very much. Couple more questions we can try and get through here. In your work, have you also drawn any parallels between BIPOC discrimination and rural poor discrimination in general, and as well as rural poor populations? For example, rural Appalachia and environmental destruction in that area.
Yeah, so as I said, the work that I did in particular was very much focused on white supremacy and racism in an urban context, so I didn't do as much of that. I know some of the other work we're doing that Jen can maybe touch on has focused a little bit more in the rural context, especially being in North Carolina. So I think you could speak to that, Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. There are really distinct parallels here, and a lot of those parallels go to the one, understanding the history, and really the history of, how white became a race and the racial hierarchy that was created in white and whiteness. And the book that Allie just mentioned, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, really goes into a great analysis of both how race was created, how racial hierarchies were created, and racial hierarchies across Western culture coming into the United States as well. And then looking at this honestly from an intersectional issue, because when race is not the issue, class will do the work of race. So thinking about it from the perspective, again, of power and decision making, and how those issues show up so often in rural white communities as well, as it relates to who is making decisions for whom and how. And those are really strong parallels that I'd recommend, just again diving into the history of that work, and then diving then back into the conversation about the message and the messenger, because stepping into these conversations with people who have not been in them, that first interaction can either call people in or shut folks down. And so really doing this work, and the work that Allie has done, has really meant to be a calling in. So how do we understand the work that we're doing and how we're doing it, so that we can even start conversations about how we might do that differently?
Thank you so much. We're hoping to end here in just a minute, but hopefully we got 2 more questions, and we'd love to get answers to those if possible. So one of them is, I'm currently working on at a nonprofit food distribution organization. What are some actions my organization and I can take to address systemic and policy change while still fulfilling our immediate responsibility of distributing food to those in need?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're starting to think about that. One thing that we've been trying to do around food distribution in the emergency food system is thinking of narrative change. So thinking of changing that narrative from that focus on food distribution as the solution to thinking of how can, food distribution organizations shift to also be addressing root causes. So addressing the fact that, hunger is a symptom of poverty. And so to address hunger, we need to address poverty, and why Hunger is doing a lot of great work around closing the hunger gap and really focusing on that narrative change. So I would definitely suggest looking into their work and seeing how you guys might be able to get involved with closing the hunger gap and with that narrative change. I think if you think over the fact that there are, 60,000 food, emergency food organizations in the United States, could you imagine if all of those got on board with advocating for a living wage or advocating for higher SNAP dollars, et cetera? So I think that advocacy piece and that narrative change piece is super important to starting to create the change, even if it's one organization at a time.
Wonderful, thank you. And this last one, maybe we can end with this, is really more of a comment, but as a teacher, we had a sensitivity training in the 1970s in which we learned through stimulations, dyads, triads, how to listen and how to deal with patterns of behavior we didn't know we had. It was alternative to current drug ed programs, which had similar us-them issues. It was very helpful, and I hear the need for a lot of similar things here. So any closing thoughts on that?
I think that us them, like as Jen said, this is a calling in. It's not intended to call anyone out or make anyone feel like they're being attacked. It's more to be like, this is the reality of what has happened, and this is how 400 years of racism and discrimination has occurred in our country. And so if we want to meaningfully create change in the food system, that has to be taken into account when we're thinking of policies and practices. And so it's not about creating a white people versus everyone else and then attacking the white people. It's about everyone else has lived with this socialization of white supremacy and its effects, and white people do too. Like as Jen said, class acts as race does, and that is still stemming from whiteness and white supremacy. So thinking that we're all a part of this and we all need to be involved, and it's not a one group versus the other, but it's all of us together. Jen, any thoughts?
Perfect. Nope. We'll end with you, Ali. Great job.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that wonderful comments to end with. I really appreciated your talk and your willingness to go through that question and answer. And thank you, Jen, for joining us for that as well. Really, really grateful for both of your work. Want to thank all of our participants for joining us. Our next session is 10 a.m. tomorrow. And so really hope that many of you will be able to join us for that. And over the next month of events, really excited about what there is to offer, and really excited to dive into these issues as a community, both locally and regionally and beyond. So thank you for that. Please fill out an evaluation on your way out the door. You should receive a link to that, and if not, we'll be following up with an email evaluation. So thank you all for your time, and I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of the daylight hours here.